She thought her quiet life at the edge of the woods was over. Just tea, silence, and an empty porch swing. Then 2 raccoons showed up, turning her loneliness upside down. They brought laughter, but also danger she never saw coming. And when a masked intruder broke into her home with a knife, those unlikely little guardians turned her house into a battlefield. Evelyn Carter's little house sat on the edge of town where the pine woods began, a simple 1-story place with peeling paint and a sagging porch swing. It was quiet there, almost too quiet. At 68, she had grown used to silence, but some days it pressed against her chest like a weight. Since her husband Frank passed away 3 years earlier, mornings felt the longest. The kettle whistled, the clock ticked, and the only voice in the house was the one inside her head. Her daughter lived in Chicago, busy with her job and family. Her son was all the way down in Texas, calling now and then when work allowed. Evelyn didn't blame them. She remembered what it was like to juggle careers and children. Still, their absence left long stretches of stillness that she filled with books, knitting half-finished scarves, and endless cups of tea at the kitchen table. The backyard had once been Frank's domain. He had built the fence himself, planted roses along the edges, and nailed up a birdhouse that still hung crooked near the maple tree. Now the roses grew wild, the grass sometimes too high, and the birdhouse leaned as if waiting for someone's hand to set it right. Evelyn kept up as best she could, but alone, she often let things slide. What did it matter if the lawn was shaggy? No one came by to notice. It was on one of those early spring mornings, while sipping her tea and gazing out the kitchen window, that she saw them. At first, she thought it was a cat digging at the garbage bin. She set her cup down and leaned closer, pressing her hand to the glass. 2 raccoons were wrestling with the lid of her trash can, determined little bandits with ringed tails and bright, mischievous eyes. One scrambled onto the lid, bouncing its weight until the metal gave a hollow bang. The other pawed at the edge, clever little fingers working like tools. Instead of hurrying outside to shoo them away, Evelyn found herself chuckling. The bolder one tumbled backward when the lid slipped, rolling into the grass with a squeak that almost sounded like laughter. The quieter one stood still, staring up at the window as if it knew someone was watching. Their eyes met, and for a strange moment, Evelyn felt less alone. "Rusty," she whispered, pointing at the bold one still bouncing around. Then her gaze shifted to the other, more cautious creature. "And you'll be Shadow." Naming them felt silly, but it gave her heart a flutter she hadn't felt in a long time. They weren't pets, of course. They were wild, messy, probably a nuisance. Yet in that instant, they seemed like unexpected guests who had wandered into her quiet life. For the rest of the morning, she found herself drifting back to the window, peeking at the yard. The raccoons had vanished into the woods, leaving the trash bin tipped and a trail of apple cores and paper scraps across the grass. Ordinarily, the mess would have annoyed her. Instead, she laughed again as she cleaned it up, muttering to herself about the 2 rascals who had decided her house was worth visiting. By afternoon, Evelyn was telling herself not to get used to them. Wild animals came and went. She'd seen deer in the yard before, foxes darting through the trees, but something about Rusty and Shadow felt different. Maybe it was the way they worked as a pair, or the way Shadow's eyes had lingered on hers through the glass. She could not explain it, but she carried that image with her the rest of the day, like a spark of warmth in a room that had been cold for too long. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters and the old house creaked in the dark, Evelyn thought about the raccoons again. She pictured their tiny hands prying open lids, the striped tails swishing as they darted around the yard. Mischievous, yes, but also alive, full of energy that her home had been missing. For the first time in a long while, she drifted off to sleep, with a smile on her face. The next morning she brewed her tea early and set her chair by the window, just in case. The yard was empty at first, the grass damp with dew, and the birdhouse leaning in its usual way. But Evelyn waited, her heart oddly expectant, as though she knew her new companions would return. And deep down, she hoped they would, because, for the first time in years, the house didn't feel quite so empty. By the end of that same week, Evelyn had fallen into a new morning habit. She set her tea on the windowsill, drew the curtain just enough to hide her face, and waited for the soft rustle that meant the backyard had company. The raccoons never arrived at the same time twice, but they came as surely as the postman. Shadow often appeared first, slipping out from the trees like a gray whisper. Rusty followed a beat later, chest out, tail high, as if the yard belonged to him, and he was graciously allowing the house to stay. They were laughable and endearing, and a little bit scandalous. Rusty figured out the bungee cord she had looped around the trash lid, not by brute force, but by patience. Pinch, tug, step back, try again, until the cord snapped loose with a twang that made him hop in surprise. Shadow didn't touch the bin. He waited politely for Rusty to do the messy part, then chose a single peel or crust and padded away to eat it with delicate hands, as if dining at a quiet cafe. When Rusty got too greedy, Shadow scolded him with a short churr. Rusty churred back, then, in a flourish of drama, flopped onto his side to play dead until Shadow nudged him, at which point he popped up, triumphant, as if he'd fooled them all. Evelyn tried to be sensible. She rinsed containers, tied the bags tight, and slid a paving stone on top of the lid. She never fed them, never opened a door to say hello. Still, there were slips. One afternoon she left a bag of stale rolls by the back steps, intending to carry it to the bin after folding laundry. 10 minutes later, Rusty had unknotted the plastic and tossed rolls like parade confetti. He found the single cinnamon twist and sat on the step, nibbling as the breeze stirred his whiskers. When he finished, he put both hands on the empty bag and peered inside as though the bakery might magically restock. Evelyn, watching through the screen door, pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from laughing out loud. Word of her visitors did not take long to cross the fence. John Miller stopped by on Saturday with a jar of his wife's peach jam and a worried squint. He was a square-shouldered man in his early 70s, a former police sergeant with knees that still remembered 100-foot chases. He had a habit of scanning a room before he sat down, and he never faced a window with his back. "I hear you've got company," he said, setting the jar on the counter. "Small, ring-tailed, and entitled." "Company might be too strong," she said, pouring coffee for both of them. "More like passing acquaintances." "Passing acquaintances don't learn your schedule," he said gently. "They're smart, Evelyn. Smarter than most folks give them credit for, and they're wild. You don't want them thinking your house is an open diner." "I don't feed them," she said, and it was true. They help themselves. That's what worries me. He leaned on his palms. "Lock the back door. Keep the bin snapped. And if they get too bold, clap, shout, make noise. Better they respect a boundary now than push it later." She promised she would. After he left, she stood at the sink with the dish towel in her hands, watching the yard. Respect, she thought. That was the word. She respected their wildness, their lives beyond the fence, the invisible map of paths and hideouts she would never see. But she felt, too, a tug that was hard to name. It wasn't simply loneliness. It was recognition, as if the house had finally been noticed by something alive that had no use for sympathy or small talk, and came anyway. The raccoon's antics crept into her daily chores. She swept the porch with an eye on the steps where Rusty liked to sit. She shook crumbs from the dishcloth straight into the bin, then double-checked the bungee cord with a firmness that would have made John proud. In the evenings, she texted her daughter a blurry photo, 2 gray shapes in the twilight, and got back a line of heart emojis and a plea. "Mom, be careful." Her son sent a thumbs up and an article about rabies, which she did not read past the headline. There were moments that felt like scenes from a small-town comedy. One afternoon, the UPS driver paused at the curb with her new kettle. Rusty, caught mid-snoop on the porch bench, froze with both hands pressed to the cushion like a burglar in a cartoon. The driver and Evelyn stared. Rusty stared back. Then he slid, inch by inch, beneath the bench skirt and vanished, as if the planks had swallowed him whole. The driver laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes before handing over the package. Shadow, for his part, seemed to study Evelyn as much as she studied him. When she watered the roses, he watched from the shade and leaned forward at the hiss of the hose. When she sat on the porch swing with her book, he kept to the far side of the steps, never approaching, but never leaving either. If she turned a page or sipped her tea too loudly, he flicked an ear. The attention was not hostile. It felt like the mild, courteous interest of a traveler waiting in the same station, aware, alert, unafraid. John swung by again, midweek, to replace a warped slat on her side gate. He worked with a slow, thorough patience, testing the latch twice, and then a third time. "We've had break-ins on Maple and Cedar," he said, voice low. "Daytime, can you believe it? People watching houses, learning routines. If you see a gray van idling at the corner, no plates, call me. Don't go out to check." Evelyn promised again. She meant it. Yet when she lifted her gaze to the woods and saw Shadow lift his head in the same instant, a steady calm rose in her chest. She didn't think herself protected. She wasn't foolish. But she no longer felt invisible. The weather turned unsettled, a run of warm days followed by a sudden snap of cold. The wind knocked a few shingles loose, and the porch swing sang in the night like a foghorn. On Thursday, clouds hunkered low over the tree line, and the yard took on that early evening gloom that made the kitchen clock seem louder than usual. Evelyn cooked a simple supper, chicken and peas, a spoon of applesauce the way she liked it, then set her plate in the sink and wiped the counter until it shone. She pulled the trash bag tight, carried it through the mudroom, and dropped it into the bin, making sure the bungee cord bit the handle. The paving stone went back on top with a no-nonsense thud. She was halfway to the house when she heard it, a thin metallic clink, followed by a scrabble, and a soft, strangled sound that didn't belong to wind or hinge. She turned, heart tapping faster. The yard looked ordinary. Grass, fence, the maple's dark shape. But the sound came again, quick and desperate, from the shadowed corner near the tool shed. "Hello?" she called before her mind caught up to the foolishness of the word. "John?" No answer. Only the clink, a rattle really, and a short breathy yip that made the hairs lift on her arms. She stepped off the path, careful of the wet grass, and moved toward the shed, each footfall slow. The smell of damp leaves rose around her. The world seemed to narrow. The shed wall, the shallow trench where storm water ran, the tangle of ivy she kept meaning to pull. Then she saw him. Rusty lay half on his side, half crouched, one back leg trapped in a small steel device the size of a dessert plate. It had teeth like a cruel bracelet, and a short chain staked to the ground. He wasn't bleeding much, thank God, but his ribs heaved with quick, frightened breaths. At the sound of her step, he whipped his head around and showed all his teeth. A warning flash. Evelyn stopped dead, lifting her hands, palms outward, the universal peace sign between species. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, voice shaking. "Oh, honey, who did this to you?" Shadow appeared from the darkness, as if passing through the shed boards, a grey ripple that resolved into a tense, low body. He stood between Rusty and Evelyn, head lowered, eyes bright, and let out a sound she had never heard from him, a rough, rolling growl that vibrated against the fence slats. The message was plain: "Do not come closer." Evelyn swallowed. Her mind flicked through foolish options: scissors, butter, a blanket, dismissed them, then returned to the simple fact of the thing. This was a trap, a real trap, not an old barn relic. Someone had set it in her yard. The injustice of it, mean and sneaky and small, rose like heat in her throat. "It's okay," she said, though it wasn't. "I won't hurt him." Shadow didn't move. She took one step back, not forward, and Shadow's growl softened. Rusty's chest kept racing. In the near distance, a car rolled through the intersection, a muffled bass thump under the dull sky. The house behind her glowed warm from the kitchen light. She pictured the drawer with the sturdy leather garden gloves. She pictured the old bolt cutters hanging on a nail in the garage, left from Frank's shop days. She pictured, too, John's number on the fridge, written in her daughter's tidy hand. "Just hold on," she murmured, to the raccoon, to herself, to the weak light pooling on the grass. "Hold on, Rusty." Another clink, another short yip. Shadow shifted his weight, and for an instant his gaze met hers, not trusting, not forgiving, but not entirely closed. She read a narrow chance in it, a narrow door. Behind that door was fear, and behind the fear was pain, and behind the pain was the simple will to live that had carried her through nights when sleep would not come. Evelyn stepped back again, slow as a tide, until she reached the porch. She opened the mudroom quietly, because quiet felt like respect. She reached for the gloves with fingers that weren't as steady as she wished. The bolt cutters were heavier than she remembered. She set them down, breathed once, and picked them up again. When she turned for the yard, the wind pushed at the door with a low moan, as if the house wished to keep her inside. "Not this time," she told it, and her voice surprised her with its steadiness. She flicked on the back light. The shed corner jumped into sharper relief, a triangle of gold on wet grass. Rusty lifted his head. Shadow's ears pricked forward. The chain gave a tiny, hopeless jingle that landed in her heart like a nail. "Hold on," she said again, and crossed the porch. The bolt cutters were heavier than Evelyn expected, the metal cold against her palms, even through the thick garden gloves. She carried them across the yard with a kind of shaky resolve, her heart knocking against her ribs as if to remind her that this was dangerous, foolish, maybe impossible. The last thing she should be doing at her age and alone was approaching a wild raccoon caught in a steel trap. But Rusty's strangled cry still echoed in her ears, and she couldn't push it aside. She paused a few feet away. Shadow crouched low, his body rigid, his dark mask staring her down. He made a sound halfway between a hiss and a growl, deep and rolling, protective in a way that sent a shiver through her. Evelyn steadied her voice. "It's all right, Shadow. I'm not here to hurt him." Her words came out gentle, the same way she had once spoken to frightened students on the first day of school. She remembered kneeling beside a trembling 6-year-old boy who clutched his lunchbox like a shield, telling him softly that it was okay to be scared, that he wasn't alone. That same tone now carried across the wet grass to 2 animals who had no reason to trust her. Rusty gave another yip, thrashing once against the trap, and the cruel teeth clamped tighter around his leg. Evelyn felt the sound in her bones. She took another step forward, moving slowly, lowering the bolt cutters so they didn't look like a threat. Shadow's growl rumbled again, but softer this time, less a warning than a question. "It's okay," she whispered, breath misting in the cool night air. "Let me help." She lowered herself to one knee, her joints protesting, the damp soaking through the fabric of her slacks. From this distance, she could see Rusty's fur bristling, his eyes wide with panic. He bared his teeth once, then sagged against the chain, panting. The sight struck something deep in her, a helplessness she remembered from another lifetime, sitting at Frank's hospital bed while machines beeped and doctors spoke in careful voices. Back then, she hadn't been able to do anything. Tonight, at least, she could try. She reached forward with the bolt cutters, keeping her motions slow and deliberate. The chain rattled when she touched it. Shadow tensed, his claws scraping the dirt, but he didn't lunge. Evelyn took that tiny mercy and pressed on. The trap had 2 jaws held by a spring bar. She lined the cutters over the chain link instead. It was the quickest way. She squeezed, her arms trembling with the effort, and the metal groaned but didn't give. Her breath hitched. She tried again, this time putting her full weight into it. With a sharp snap, the link gave way. The trap stayed clamped, but the chain no longer held Rusty to the ground. For a heartbeat, he just stared, stunned. Then he gave a violent twist and pulled free, dragging the trap still attached to his leg. Evelyn's heart lurched, afraid he would tear himself worse, but to her surprise, Shadow darted in, bumping his muzzle against Rusty's shoulder, steadying him. Together, they stumbled into the deeper shadow of the shed. Evelyn let out a shaky laugh that was half sob. "You're free now," she whispered, though they were already out of sight. Her knees wobbled as she stood. She bent to pick up the broken chain, the sharp metal edges glinting in the porch light. Someone had set that in her yard, on purpose. Not just careless kids, not a relic from another era, a fresh, cruel trap. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the weather. She carried the chain to the porch, laid it on the step, and sat heavily beside it. Her hands were trembling, the gloves smeared with dirt and fur. The night pressed close around her, the pine woods whispering, the house creaking as if listening. For a long while she stayed like that, until the adrenaline eased and exhaustion slipped in behind it. When she finally went inside, she left the porch light on. A silent promise, perhaps, that they could find their way back. The next morning, Evelyn was up early, cradling her tea near the window. The yard looked ordinary again, dew sparkling on the grass, the birdhouse tilting as always. For a while she thought they were gone for good. Then, near the roses, she saw a flicker of grey. Shadow stood there, alert but calm. He looked thinner in the daylight, the dark mask of his face more striking. Beside him, limping slightly, came Rusty. The trap was gone, shaken off somewhere in the woods, but a raw patch of fur marked his hind leg. He moved carefully, but he moved. Evelyn pressed a hand to the glass, her throat tightening. "You made it," she whispered. Rusty, irrepressible even now, clambered onto the overturned bucket by the shed and sat upright like a clown on a stage. He pawed at the air, then toppled backward in a deliberate comic fall that ended in the grass. Evelyn laughed out loud, a sound that startled even herself. Shadow gave a low chuff, almost like a sigh, and padded closer to his friend. The two of them lingered in the yard for several minutes before slipping back toward the woods. It was long enough for Evelyn to feel that the strange bond between them had deepened, sealed by the night's ordeal. She had saved Rusty, but in some way, they had saved her too. Later that afternoon, John knocked on her door. He wore his old jacket, the one with the faded police patch still stitched at the shoulder. "Heard any more racket out back?" he asked casually, though his eyes searched hers for the truth. Evelyn hesitated. She thought of telling him everything, about the trap, about freeing Rusty. But something in her resisted. She didn't want animal control called, didn't want the raccoons treated as pests. Instead, she shrugged. "Just the wind, I suppose." John studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but keep your eyes open. Folks aren't always kind. And sometimes, well, sometimes danger comes from where you least expect it." After he left, Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching the trees sway. His words lingered in her mind. Danger could come from anywhere, but so, she realized, could help. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, she saw two striped tails vanish into the brush. A fleeting glimpse, but enough. The house didn't feel quite so lonely anymore. The days grew longer as April rolled in, and the first hints of green touched the maples beyond Evelyn's fence. The world seemed softer, lighter, the way spring always did, but beneath that sweetness ran a thread of unease that Evelyn couldn't quite shake. The trap in her yard had unsettled her more than she admitted to anyone, even herself. Who would set such a thing so close to a house, and why? She tried to put it out of mind, but each time she spotted Rusty limping, or Shadow pausing to scan the tree line, her chest tightened. It wasn't only her yard. The town itself felt different. The weekly paper, usually filled with church socials and high school ball scores, carried an uneasy headline. "Third break-in in as many weeks." Someone had been targeting homes on the edge of town, the ones where older folks lived alone. The thieves didn't smash windows or spray graffiti. They were quiet, deliberate, slipping inside when no one was watching, taking jewelry, cash, anything small enough to pocket. Nobody had been hurt, yet, but the whisper of danger crept into every conversation. At the grocery store, Evelyn overheard two women murmuring by the produce bins. Edna's silver was gone just like that, and she was in the next room, imagine. One shivered. "It's not safe anymore." Evelyn folded her receipt and walked out with her milk and bread, her heart beating faster than the short trip should allow. That evening, John stopped by, as he often did, with a bag of nails in his pocket and worry in his eyes. He insisted on checking the latches on her windows, tugging them twice to be sure. "They're getting bolder," he said, straightening his stiff back. "Middle of the day over on Maple. Folks saw a man watching houses, no plates on his van. Evelyn, you've got to be careful. Don't let anyone in. Not even if they say they're with the utility company. And call me if you see so much as a shadow that doesn't belong." She nodded, though she tried to keep her tone light. "I'll manage, John. Besides, I have 2 little watchmen." His brow furrowed. "Those raccoons again. They'll chew through your wiring before they guard anything." But his words lacked bite. He'd seen the way her face lit when she spoke of them. He couldn't quite bring himself to snuff out that glow. That night, Evelyn sat at the kitchen window with her tea. The backyard lay hushed under the moonlight, and sure enough, Two striped tails wove through the grass. Rusty clambered onto the fence post with exaggerated effort, his injured legs slowing him, but not dimming his spirit. Shadow followed, more measured, scanning the yard before settling near the roses. Evelyn leaned forward, whispering to herself, "You two know more than you let on, don't you?" Rusty tipped his head back, gnawed at the fence post, and then let himself tumble dramatically into the leaves below. Evelyn chuckled, shaking her head. They were trouble, yes, but they were hers in some strange way. And perhaps trouble, she thought, wasn't always a curse. Sometimes it was a kind of company. The next afternoon brought a new kind of chill. Evelyn was sorting laundry when she caught movement at the far edge of her yard. Not Rusty, not Shadow. She knew their shapes by now. This was taller, heavier. A man standing just beyond the property line, half hidden by the brush. She froze at the window, heart rising to her throat. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, as if taking measure of the house. She blinked, and he was gone, melting back into the trees. Perhaps it was nothing, she told herself. Someone cutting through on the way to the creek. Maybe a hunter scouting early. But the unease lingered. She didn't tell John. She didn't want another lecture, another worried shake of the head. She simply locked the back door with more force than usual and left the kitchen light burning late into the night. Rusty and Shadow came again, their presence both comfort and reminder. Rusty dragged an old tennis ball from somewhere and battered it against the porch steps with comic determination. Shadow, dignified as ever, sat close by as if keeping watch, his black eyes fixed on the dark tree line. Evelyn watched them until her lids grew heavy, and in that watching, the tension eased enough to let her sleep. But the seed had been planted. She found herself double-checking locks, glancing over her shoulder when she carried groceries, pausing before she opened the curtains in the morning. The world outside her little home had shifted, and she felt the balance tipping. Still, every time Rusty scrambled over her fence with his boundless mischief, or Shadow settled quietly at the edge of the roses like a sentry, Evelyn felt something steadier than fear. The town might be shadowed by whispers of crime, but her own shadows had names, and striped tails, and eyes that seemed to see her more clearly than most people ever did. Danger was close. She knew that now. But so was loyalty, in the most unlikely form. And as the weeks stretched on, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the story of her two raccoons and the trouble creeping closer to her street was about to collide in ways none of them could predict. The rain started just after sunset, soft at first, tapping the shingles like a polite visitor before settling in for the night. Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing her teacup, listening to the steady rhythm on the roof. She liked rain, usually. It was comforting, the kind of sound that smoothed the edges of loneliness. But tonight the sound felt different. The house seemed to lean into the storm, creaking in places she didn't recognize, and she found herself checking each lock once more before pulling the curtains closed. She carried her book into the living room, but the words blurred. Her mind kept circling back to the man she'd glimpsed by the trees. Had she really seen him? Or had her imagination, sharpened by John's warnings, played a trick? She told herself not to fret, not to spin ghosts out of shadows. Yet when the wind rattled the shutters, she flinched. Rusty and Shadow hadn't appeared that evening, and their absence added to her unease. She had grown used to the sense of them drifting at the edges of her life, their mischief and quiet company a strange but steady comfort. Without them, the night seemed emptier, the house too large. She turned on the radio for background noise, letting an old country song hum through the room. That was when she heard it. A faint scrape, not the usual creak of timber or groan of wind, a deliberate sound, metallic, from the back door. Evelyn's stomach tightened. She set her book aside and leaned forward, every sense sharpened. Another scrape followed, then a muffled click. Her hand went instinctively to the phone on the end table, but in that moment the back door gave way with a sudden jolt. The kitchen light swung across the floor as the door eased open. A figure stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black from boots to gloves. A knit mask covered his face, only his eyes visible, cold, flat eyes that moved swiftly across the room. Evelyn froze where she sat, her body refusing to obey the voice in her head that screamed, "Move, call John, do something." The phone slipped from her hand and landed on the carpet with a soft thud. The intruder closed the door behind him, slow and quiet. He didn't rush, didn't stumble. He moved with purpose, the sure steps of someone who had studied her house, who knew she was alone. His gloved hand reached into a pocket, and when it came out, a knife glinted in the dim light. Evelyn's breath caught. She pressed back into the sofa cushions, her heart pounding. Her mind flashed to the stories she had overheard at the grocery store, the whispered fears of neighbors, the headlines. "Not here, not me," she thought desperately. The man's eyes landed on her, and in that moment he seemed to relax, as if reassured by the sight. An elderly woman alone, frail, no threat at all. He took a step closer, lifting the knife just enough to make its meaning clear. "Please," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't have to." A sudden thump cut her words short. The intruder stiffened and turned his head toward the sound. It came from the sliding glass door that opened onto the backyard. Another thump followed, louder, sharper, as if something had struck the glass. Evelyn's eyes darted toward the door, hope and fear tangled in her chest. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw movement, a striped tail, a flash of grey fur. Rusty. He smacked the glass again with both paws, bouncing back and forth, a frantic blur of motion. Behind him, Shadow crouched low, eyes gleaming, his body tense as a coiled spring. The intruder snarled under his mask, startled but not yet afraid. He stepped toward the glass door, knife still in hand, perhaps thinking it was only animals, a nuisance he could scare away. He reached for the handle. Evelyn tried to shout no, but the word caught in her throat. The man slid the door open a crack, the rain rushing in with a hiss. That was when the storm truly broke. Rusty shot through the gap like a missile, his claws flashing, striking the man's arm. The knife clattered to the floor as the intruder stumbled backward, cursing. Before he could recover, Shadow surged in, launching himself low and fast. His teeth sank into the man's pant leg, his claws raking across the fabric. The intruder shouted, kicking wildly, trying to shake them off. Rusty scrambled up his back, clinging to his shoulder, tugging at the mask with his nimble hands. Evelyn, stunned, watched the scene unfold like a mad dream. Her two ragged little raccoons had turned into fierce protectors, wild and fearless. For a split second, she thought of doing nothing, letting them handle it. But instinct jolted her into motion. She grabbed the heavy lamp from the end table, its cord yanking free as she swung with all the strength her arms could muster. The base struck the man square between the shoulders. He lurched forward with a cry, losing his balance as Shadow released his leg and Rusty sprang away. The knife lay at Evelyn's feet. She kicked it across the floor, out of reach. The intruder scrambled toward it, but Rusty was quicker. With a squeal that was half laugh, half snarl, he darted forward and swiped the blade farther under the sofa. The man's cold eyes flicked from Evelyn to the raccoons, disbelief etched into every line of his masked face. He had expected a frail old woman, an easy job. Instead, he had walked into chaos. Lamp blows, wild animals, resistance he had never prepared for. For the first time, Evelyn saw uncertainty in his stance. And in that hesitation, she felt her own fear shift into something else. Defiance. "You picked the wrong house," she said, her voice low but steady. Outside, thunder cracked, rolling over the roof. Inside, Rusty hissed, Shadow growled, and Evelyn held her ground. The night was no longer quiet, no longer safe, but it was hers, and she was no longer alone. The intruder staggered from the lamp's blow, catching himself on the edge of the sofa. For a breathless second, the living room fell into an eerie hush, broken only by the patter of rain through the half-open door. Then, Rusty let out a piercing chatter, the sound sharp and mocking, like laughter in the face of danger. He darted up the curtain, claws biting into the fabric, swinging himself higher with a reckless joy that made the curtain rod groan. The man lunged after him, furious, but Shadow was faster. The quieter Raccoon streaked low across the carpet, wrapping nimble paws around the man's ankle and biting down with surprising force. The intruder shouted, jerking back. Rusty seized his chance. He leapt from the curtain straight onto the man's shoulder, his striped tail whipping in the air. With deft little hands he clawed at the mask, tugging it sideways until one cold, startled eye glared out. Evelyn's heart pounded. The scene was chaos. An old woman clutching a broken lamp, rain spilling through the door, and two scrappy raccoons turning her quiet house into a battlefield. She wanted to scream for help, but her voice came out as a hoarse command instead. "Get out of my house!" The intruder shoved Rusty off, the little body tumbling across the rug. But before he could move toward the knife under the sofa, Evelyn stepped forward. She swung the lamp base again, clipping his side. It wasn't a hard blow, but it made him stumble into the coffee table. Rusty was on him in an instant, claws flashing, squealing with furious delight. Shadow followed, a silent grey streak, planting himself between the man and the open door, as if to cut off escape. The intruder realized too late that retreat was his only option. He twisted toward the sliding door, but Rusty blocked his path, scampering across the floor with his comical, limping gait that somehow only made him seem bolder. Shadow crouched low, teeth bared, his growl vibrating through the small room. The man looked between them, calculating. Evelyn saw the shift in his stance, the moment he decided to lunge. Her breath caught. He bolted for the door. Rusty launched upward, landing square on his chest. Claws ripped across the black fabric, tearing it open in ragged streaks. The man tried to shove him off, but Shadow struck next, swiping at the back of his calf. The man howled, his leg buckling. For a moment Evelyn thought they had him pinned, but desperation lent him strength. With a violent twist, he flung Rusty into the air. The little raccoon landed hard against the sofa, but scrambled upright, shaking himself, eyes blazing. The man lurched toward the yard, half falling through the open door into the rain. Shadow pursued, silent and relentless. Evelyn followed as far as the porch, the storm drenching her hair and nightgown. She saw the intruder stumble across the slick grass, Rusty already bounding after him despite his injured leg. Shadow cut around to flank, forcing the man toward the fence. He reached it, threw himself upward, fingers clawing at the wet wood. For an instant he dangled there, one leg hooked, the other scrabbling for purchase. Rusty made his final move. He launched with every ounce of strength he had, striking the man's calf with a fierce swipe. The man shouted, losing his grip, and toppled headfirst over the fence into the muddy alley beyond. Silence rushed in, broken only by the drumming rain. Rusty landed in the grass, chest heaving, soaked but triumphant. Shadow padded up beside him, brushing against his shoulder with a brief, firm touch, as if to steady his friend. Evelyn clutched the porch railing, stunned at what she had just witnessed. Her phone lay forgotten inside, but her body moved on instinct now. She stumbled back in, grabbed it with shaking hands, and punched 911. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "This is Evelyn Carter, on Pine Hollow Road. A man. He broke into my house. He's hurt. He ran. Please, send someone quickly." The dispatcher's calm voice filled her ear, grounding her. Help was on the way. Stay inside. Keep the doors locked. Evelyn closed the sliding door and turned the lock with trembling fingers. Rusty and Shadow were still outside, water streaming from their fur, eyes shining in the porch light. Rusty gave a sharp chirr, as if scolding her for worrying. Shadow simply stared at the glass, steady, unflinching. She pressed her palm against the door. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice breaking with both fear and gratitude. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder. Evelyn sagged into the sofa, clutching the phone, watching as her two unlikely guardians slipped back into the shadows of the rain-soaked yard. She knew the police would never believe what had truly happened here tonight, and perhaps she wouldn't tell them. Some things belonged only to those who had lived them, the old woman and the two wild creatures who had chosen, for reasons of their own, to stand by her. The house still trembled with the echoes of chaos, but Evelyn no longer trembled. For the first time in years, she felt something fierce burning in her chest. Not fear, but life. The sirens grew closer, cutting through the storm, flashing red and blue against the wet glass of Evelyn's front windows. She stood in the living room, one hand still pressed against the sliding door where Rusty and Shadow had disappeared. Her chest heaved, not from exertion, but from the sheer weight of what had happened. She had survived. The house was still standing, and the man who thought her home an easy mark had left it bloodied and beaten. Not by police, not by neighbors, but by two wild creatures no one would ever believe had fought for her. Headlights swung across the yard, washing the porch in pale beams. Evelyn unlocked the front door with trembling hands, letting two uniformed officers step inside. Water dripped from their jackets as they scanned the house quickly, their eyes lingering on the broken lamp, the overturned table, the knife still wedged halfway beneath the sofa. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" one asked, his voice clipped but gentle. "I'm all right," Evelyn answered, though her knees still shook. "He came in through the back. He had a knife." But he didn't get far. The officers exchanged a glance, then one radioed in. Moments later, the sound of voices carried from the alley. "We've got him," someone shouted. "Male suspect, mid-30s, multiple lacerations, limping bad. Looks like he tangled with a wild animal." Evelyn pressed a hand to her lips to hide the sudden laugh that rose there. A wild animal indeed, two of them, armed with nothing but mischief and claws. Within minutes the small yard filled with activity. Flashlights swept the grass. Boots squelched in the mud. A paramedic crouched in the alley beside the suspect, who groaned as they checked his wounds. The officers brought him into view, his mask pulled off now, revealing a face battered and streaked with rain. He was younger than she expected, his jaw sharp, eyes defiant even in defeat. Detective Morrison, a stocky man with thinning hair, arrived not long after. He questioned Evelyn gently but thoroughly, notebook in hand. "So he forced the back door?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady now. "I was in the living room. He came in with a knife. I grabbed the lamp and swung. He stumbled, fell, and then, I suppose he ran. He tripped over himself in the rain. Morrison's brows rose slightly. And the scratches? The bite marks? Evelyn swallowed. Here was the moment she had to choose. She thought of Rusty clambering up the curtain, Shadow's steady growl as he barred the way both of them had stood by her when no one else was there. If she told the truth, animal control might come, might set traps of their own, might take her unexpected companions away. "I suppose," she said carefully, "a raccoon or stray dog must have been out there in the yard. The rain probably startled it. You know how wildlife is around here." Morrison scribbled the answer, nodding. "That would explain it. Raccoons can be vicious if cornered." "Yes," Evelyn murmured, eyes flicking toward the shadows outside. "Vicious. That must be it." John appeared at her porch just then, hair plastered to his forehead, his breath ragged from running through the rain. He carried an old hickory cane he sometimes used as a walking stick, though tonight he held it like a weapon. "Evelyn," he called, bursting in. "Are you all right? I heard the sirens." His eyes swept the wreckage of her living room. "Lord above." She forced a smile. "I'm fine, John. Shaken, but fine." He gripped her hand, his rough palm warm against hers. "I should have been here sooner." "You couldn't have known," she said gently. But John's gaze moved past her to the back door, where muddy paw prints smeared across the porch boards. His brows drew together, suspicion mingling with something like wonder. He didn't ask, not yet, but she could see the question forming in his mind. The police took the intruder away in handcuffs, limping, his curses swallowed by the rain. They left warnings behind. "Be cautious. Reinforce your locks. Call us if anything seems amiss." Evelyn promised she would. She watched them go until the street fell quiet again, until only the hum of the cruiser engines lingered. Inside, the house smelled of wet earth and broken ceramic. She tidied slowly, righting the coffee table, sweeping the shards of the lamp into a dustpan. Her hands moved automatically, but her thoughts kept circling the image of Rusty launching himself into danger with reckless glee, of Shadow anchoring the chaos with calm ferocity. She wished she could thank them properly. Later, when John had gone home and the street was still, Evelyn stepped onto the porch. The rain had eased into a drizzle, soft against the eaves. She peered into the yard, heart heavy with longing. "Rusty? Shadow?" she whispered. For a long while, nothing stirred. Then, from the far corner near the roses, came a faint rustle. Two shapes emerged, soaked but unmistakable. Rusty shook himself violently, spraying droplets everywhere, then plopped down with an exaggerated sigh. Shadow stood close beside him, eyes fixed on her. Evelyn pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "You're still here," she breathed. Rusty chirred, then waddled toward the porch, dragging a soggy tennis ball as though to prove he still had fight in him. Shadow followed, slower, never breaking his gaze. She crouched on the step, rain dampening her hair. "You saved me," she said softly. "Both of you." Rusty dropped the ball at her feet and chattered, a sound almost like laughter. Shadow blinked once, slow and deliberate, before turning back toward the trees. The night swallowed them again, but Evelyn remained on the porch long after, warmed by a fierce gratitude. She knew no one else would ever believe it, not fully. The official story would speak of a burglar, a frightened woman, a stroke of luck. But she knew better. She had seen loyalty and courage in the unlikeliest of forms, and she would never forget it. For the first time in years, Evelyn Carter felt less like a woman growing old alone, and more like someone still guarded by family, even if that family wore fur and stripes and laughed in the rain. The following morning dawned clear and bright. The storm swept away, the sky scrubbed clean. Evelyn stood at her kitchen window, steaming mug in hand, watching the yard sparkle with leftover rain. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, a freshness that felt almost like a blessing. She touched the bruise on her arm, where the lamp had swung hard against her shoulder, a small price to pay for still being alive. The police had called at sunrise, letting her know the intruder was in custody. He had a record stretching across 3 counties, responsible for a string of burglaries. "You're fortunate," Detective Morrison had said over the line. His voice weighted. "He's hurt people before." "Badly. You might have saved others by surviving him." Fortunate, she thought now, sipping her tea. Fortune had little to do with it. 2 mischievous raccoons had made the difference, and that truth was hers to keep. Around mid-morning, John came by, toolbox in hand. He replaced the splintered lock on her back door, tightened the loose hinge, and installed an extra deadbolt. "You should think about a security system," he said, wiping his brow. "Your kids would sleep better knowing." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but I feel safer now than I did before last night." John gave her a look, half puzzled, half amused. His eyes flicked once toward the yard, where muddy paw prints still dotted the porch. "You really believe they helped you, don't you?" "I don't believe it, John," she answered softly. "I know it." He didn't press. Instead, he patted her shoulder and muttered something about keeping an eye on the alley. But as he left, she caught him glancing again at the fence line, his mouth tightening as if he wasn't so sure anymore. That evening, with the house in order and the worst behind her, Evelyn fixed herself a simple supper and sat on the porch swing. The boards creaked beneath her weight, a sound she found oddly comforting now. The yard stretched quiet and green, touched by golden light as the sun dipped low. For a long while nothing stirred. Then, just as she wondered if they had moved on, 2 striped tails appeared at the far corner. Rusty bounded forward first, dragging a dented soda can he must have pilfered from somewhere, his limp barely slowing him. He dropped it proudly at the base of the steps like an offering. Shadow followed at a slower pace, slipping into the shade near the roses, ever the sentinel. Evelyn laughed, a warm, unguarded sound. "Oh, Rusty, you silly boy." "You think I need more clutter on this porch?" Rusty chattered in reply, tipping the can over as if to demonstrate its usefulness. Shadow merely sat, dark eyes steady, as though to remind her that mischief always needed balance. Together, they made the strangest pair she had ever known, and yet she felt an affection for them that went bone deep. Her daughter called later, voice tight with worry after hearing news of the burglary. "Mom, please, think about moving closer to us. It's not safe out there anymore." Evelyn listened, nodded, promised she would consider it. But as she looked through the window at 2 small figures silhouetted against the fence, one clowning with the soda can, the other keeping silent watch, she knew her answer. This was her home, and she was not as alone as her children believed. The weeks that followed brought small changes. The neighborhood installed brighter street lamps. The church organized a watch group. The local paper ran a cautious headline: "Suspect apprehended after attempted break-in." Evelyn's name was mentioned only briefly, tucked between the facts. Nowhere did it say what really happened in her living room that night. That truth remained hers, shared only with the raccoons who returned again and again, sometimes bold, sometimes shy. Rusty grew stronger, his limp fading until he scrambled once more up the fence post to perform his comic tumbles. Shadow never strayed far, his watchful presence a constant reassurance. On quiet nights, Evelyn found herself speaking aloud as she watched them, telling them about Frank, about the children, about the little things that filled her days. They listened in their own way, Rusty tilting his head as though amused, Shadow blinking slowly in the half-light. She knew they didn't understand every word, but she also knew she wasn't speaking into silence anymore. One golden evening in early summer, she sat with her tea as the raccoons played beneath the birdhouse. Rusty batted the tennis ball back and forth, pausing now and then to glance up at her with gleaming eyes, waiting for laughter. Shadow stayed close to the roses, his gaze lifting once toward the house, then back to the woods. Evelyn's chest swelled with a mix of tenderness and awe. "Family comes in the strangest shapes," she whispered. "But family all the same." The raccoons didn't answer in words, of course. Rusty squealed, darting after the ball. Shadow flicked his ears and remained at his post, but Evelyn felt the truth of it all the same, as sure as she felt the breeze on her cheek and the fading warmth of the sun. That night, she set a framed photo of Frank back on the mantel beside the chair where she always sat. Next to it, she placed a new picture, one she had snapped just that afternoon with her old camera. Rusty perched on the fence, Shadow below, both of them caught in a shaft of evening light. Two unlikely guardians. She turned off the lamp, leaving the photos to glow in the moonlight, and went to bed with the window cracked open. From somewhere near the roses came a faint rustle, a reminder that she was not alone. And for the first time in many years, Evelyn Carter drifted into sleep without the heaviness of loneliness pressing down. She had been given the rarest of gifts, protection, companionship, and the sweet knowledge that help can come from the most unexpected places, even from two mischievous raccoons who decided she was worth fighting for